be, very learned in the Talmud as well as the esoteric world. And his son-in-law, the Avnei Nezer, Sachachaber Rabbi, his grandson, the Shem Shmuel, they're all great Talmudic giants, recognized by the Lithuanian yeshiva world. They all were in both worlds, so to speak. So out of this school came Katz, but it wasn't just Katz, there was Varka, another great scholar, who, as Reb Shlomo says, as in Katz they were known for truth, in Varka they were known for loving people. And there were internal frictions between these groups, and there was respect. Often between the Rebbes themselves there was respect, but between the disciples there was not always so much respect. Because I think there was a story with one of the Hasidim of the Katzker, I believe. He came to one of the Varka Hasidim and he says, how come you're not a Chassid of my Rebbe? You have to realize they were really contemporaries, they were equals. But he was like going over to a Rebbe and saying, how come you're not a student of my Rebbe? So the Varka, the Varka says, he goes, is the Katzker Rebbe really so small that the only way he can be a Rebbe is if I'm his Chassid? In other words, if he's really a Rebbe, he doesn't need me to be his Chassid. If he's small, then he needs me. Then I need to affirm him. I need to make him great by being his Chassid. Otherwise, he doesn't need me. Now, this is just one thought I want to give you, and then I'm going to go launch into Ishbitz itself. I'll leave you with this. What is the commonality between all these Rebbes? They were all very different, so you could say there was no way. Meaning the Simcha Bunim didn't have a derech. Because if he had a derech, he wouldn't have the Katzker and the Meshloach, even though they were very close at one point. It's very hard to find what they had in common in terms of their philosophies. I have a shir on that, but it's very speculative. It's not. It's a chiddush. It's trying to make these underlying premises that are somehow connected on the inside, even though on the outside they seem to oppose each other. And then Yitzchak Varka, who again seemed diametrically different than the Katz, because in Katz, if it's about the truth and love don't get along. They just don't coexist. So again, two ideals that seem to be opposites. And it just continues like that. So the question is, was he just some nice guy? And why did all these magnificent people, both as human beings, as scholars, as leaders, all come around this one guy if they were all so different? What were they connected to? So just in short, without getting to, because it deserves really his own shir, his own talk about him, you could say is that what he did is he nourished individuals. He didn't want you to have to be his chassid. That was the whole thing of what his chiddush was. And it wasn't just him. He was following the Yiddish Kadish's way, which is we don't want anybody just to be a cookie cutter model. Even a chassid doesn't have to be, oh, you're a chassid, this is exactly how you do it, and this is how you believe, and this is how you sing. It has to be an expression of your deepest self, of your relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not the Rebbe's relationship. And because that's what he nurtured individuals. And therefore they all were individuals, and they came out differently. Some quite differently. However, each one of them did get an element. And now there's been some scholarly work as well on what elements the Meshloach got from the Simcha Bunim. Well, you could definitely say, some people say that he was a chassid of the Katzker. You have to realize, by the time he was a chassid of the Katzker, he was also the Rosh Hashiva in Katz, which means it would be like the equivalent of saying somebody who was a chassid for a few years of a Rebbe, as somebody who was already a very accomplished scholar, who already had his name kind of training and his impressions made earlier on. He had most of his impressions made with the Simcha Bunim. That's who he developed under. He didn't develop for the most part under the Kotzker. He helped the Kotzker by being his right-hand man. Just like the Yiddish Kaddish was the right-hand man of the seer. And that is a whole other story about the break between Kotzker and Ishbitz, another fascinating part of history. There's a whole story about what happened with the Kotzker. The day that Shabbos, something happened. He was suffering from depression. He said something that was considered inappropriate by a lot of people. Most of the Hasidim left with the Ishbitzer in a breakaway movement. And many of them came back later after. Eventually, the Kotzker, I wouldn't say ever reassembled himself to what he was earlier, but continued nonetheless. But the Meir Shilach, he took this extreme view of this kind of individuality that he developed. You could say into something else, into something even stronger than perhaps his Rabbi even envisioned or imagined.
Totally the opposite of what the Chassid is. The prototype.
Well, that's one type of a chassid, meaning that you lose yourself to the group, to the Rebbe.
Right.
That isn't every type of chassid. See, in Katz, and by Simcha Bunim, and by the Yid, that wasn't what it was to be a chassid. Now, some people say, well, they weren't real chassidim then. Because how could you be a chassid if you think you have to have your own individual relationship with God? What's the need of a Rebbe then? Only the Rebbe. Some Hasidim will tell you, listen, you can't get there on your own. I mean, I know it sounds like another religion, but it isn't. It's part of Judaism is this concept that some Hasidim really believe that the average person just doesn't have the soul to make all the right connections up above. And they need a Rebbe Rebbe has this neshama of Atzilus, has a higher level of soul, and the Rebbe will be able to not only inspire you, but to really help you see who you really are. Now, even in Pshischa, they also believe that the Rebbe serves some function, or else why not just abandon it completely? But there, it was like a mentor that instead of giving you a miracle, actually talked to you and mentored you, versus just like, like I give some little thing. And I remember the other day, somebody asked me, said, can you recommend a Kabbalist? I said, I guess, like, you mean a Kabbalist who, like, a miracle one, right? They're like, yeah. No, I said, well, I could recommend maybe somebody who will talk to you, No, I don't need that. I want the one who's going to be like, this is coming down from God. I don't want anybody who talks to me ever to talk to me. So let's look a little bit at some of these texts. I think the Meir Shilach died passed away in 1859, and the Meir Shilach, the work itself, I believe, was published a couple years later by his grandson, Gershon Henoch. And it's very interesting if you actually want to do. Some people, Shaul Magid notably has written about the relationship between Gershon Henoch and his grandfather. I don't know if he's done enough of this, but just to read the Meir Shilach and then go to the Sod Yesharim, which is one of the books by Gershon Henoch, who's also a prolific writer, and find one of the teachings on the same passage that has the same topic and see the similarities and the differences. Sometimes he quotes from his grandfather, quite often, says it. Other times he just quotes him without quoting him, and other times he says things that are quite different, and it's just interesting to ask where one ends